I remember the moment I stepped into the Orange County Superior Court as if the air itself had weight. The room was already full, but my eyes found them immediately. My parents sat in the front row, hands folded neatly, shoulders relaxed, faces composed with the same calm assurance they had always worn whenever they explained things away. The same expressions they used when they told me everything was for the best, when they told me leaving was necessary, when they told me I would understand. Someday, they looked relieved, almost satisfied, as if the outcome had already been written, and this appearance was merely a formality. To anyone watching, they looked like the reasonable ones, respected professionals, polished, familiar faces in charity, galas and community events. People trusted them, believed them, and I was simply the granddaughter who had inherited something unexpectedly. But that wasn't the truth, not even close. My grandmother, Margaret Holloway, the woman who raised me after my parents walked away, had died. And in her final decision, she had left everything to me, her home, her investments, her savings, every carefully documented piece of her life. Now the same people who had once left me standing on a driveway with a small backpack and an empty promise were suing me, claiming what they believed should have been theirs all along. I stood still near the defense table as the judge flipped through the case file. The courtroom was unusually quiet. No whispering, no shuffling, just the soft sound of paper moving and the distant hum of traffic outside the courthouse windows. The judge paused, then looked up. His gaze didn't pass over me the way it did with others. It lingered, studied, measured. "Excuse me," he said slowly, narrowing his eyes just slightly. "Were you raised by Margaret Holloway?" The question landed hard, not loud, but deep, like a crack forming beneath solid ground. Across the aisle, my parents stiffened. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. Their confidence flickered for just a moment. They hadn't expected that question. They hadn't planned for it to come so early. And in that instant, I knew something they didn't. This case was not beginning the way they thought it would. "Yes, Your Honor," I said quietly. She raised me. The judge nodded once, almost to himself, and looked back down at the file. The room seemed to breathe again, but something had already shifted. That single question had pulled me backward through time, away from polished wood and legal documents, away from Orange County, back to Laguna Beach, back to a day I had spent years trying not to remember too clearly. I was 6 years old when my parents left me there. The sky that afternoon had been painfully blue, the kind that feels unreal when you look back on it. Too clean, too bright. My parents' car idled in the driveway of my grandmother's modest coastal home, engine humming impatiently. The ocean breeze carried the smell of salt and eucalyptus, and everything felt oddly rushed, like a moment being pushed forward before it was ready. My mother adjusted the strap of my small backpack as if she were sending me off to school. "Be good for Grandma Margaret," she said lightly. "We'll come get you soon." Soon. I didn't know it then, but I would learn to mistrust that word. My father stood by the car, glancing at his watch, already halfway turned away. "We'll be late," he muttered. "Late for what?" I asked. No one answered. My mother leaned down and kissed the air near my cheek, close enough to count, far enough to avoid. Then she stepped back. The car door closed. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as they reversed, turned, and disappeared down the hill. I stood there long after the sound faded, unsure whether I was supposed to move or wait. The front door opened behind me. My grandmother didn't rush. She never rushed. Margaret Holloway placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and stood with me for a moment, watching the empty road. She said nothing at first. Her silence felt different from my parents' silence. It didn't demand, it didn't avoid, they didn't explain. I whispered. She sighed softly. "No," she said. "They rarely do." That night, she made soup from scratch and let me stir the pot until my arm grew tired. Later, she tucked me into the small guest bedroom that would quietly become mine, smoothing the sheets with deliberate care. "Will they come back?" I asked. She sat beside the bed for a long moment before answering. "Some people leave because they don't know how to stay," she said. "That isn't your fault." It was the first time anyone had ever said that to me. Life with my grandmother settled into a rhythm that felt intentional, She woke early, read the newspaper front box. She believed that if something mattered, it deserved attention, not urgency. Every morning, she would point to a headline and ask, "What do you think they're leaving out?" At first, I didn't understand the question. She didn't correct me when I answered wrong. She let me think out loud, let me stumble. Margaret Holloway had been a probate attorney for over 30 years. She believed in records, in clarity, in saying exactly what you meant before someone else decided to say it for you. Memory is unreliable, she used to tell me. Paper is not. When I was 12, she taught me how to organize files. When I was 15, she showed me how to read legal language without being intimidated by it. When I was 17, she gave me a leather-bound notebook. For your own words, she said. One day, someone may try to tell your story for you. My parents never visited. They sent cards sometimes, holidays, birthdays, always carefully worded, always distant, always signed Gata. Never personal enough to reply to. Eventually, I stopped waiting. The years passed quietly. I went to college nearby. I came home on weekends. Margaret grew older, but her mind never slowed. She kept meticulous notes, even about ordinary conversations. When she fell ill, it was sudden but not chaotic. She organized everything herself. Doctors, documents, instructions. When she died, the house felt unbearably still at the reading of the will. My parents sat straight-backed and expectant. Margaret Holloway left her entire estate to her granddaughter. Not a portion, not a trust, everything. That was when the silence turned hostile. And now, standing in a courtroom decades later, watching the judge prepare to hear the case, I understood something with unsettling clarity. This was never just about inheritance. It was about which version of the past would be allowed to exist. And for the first time, I wasn't the child being spoken for. I was ready to speak for myself. After the reading of the will, my parents didn't approach me. They didn't argue or raise their voices. They didn't even look angry. They simply exchanged a glance, brief and practiced, the kind that had once passed silently between them, in cars and hallways, and then they left the room without saying a word. That silence carried more intention than any confrontation could have. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't shock, it was calculation. Margaret's attorney, Daniel Brooks, lingered behind as the room emptied. He adjusted his glasses and studied me for a moment with something close to sympathy. She anticipated this, he said quietly. Anticipated what? I asked, even though I already knew the answer, that they wouldn't accept her decision. The weeks that followed, I learned just how thoroughly my grandmother had prepared. Her home in Laguna Beach was modest by coastal standards, but every drawer held order. Every cabinet had purpose. Deeds were filed by date. Correspondence was labeled and cross-referenced. Handwritten notes were clipped carefully to documents, they explained. She had lived the way she practiced law, deliberately, with clarity. Nothing was accidental. One afternoon, while sorting through a filing cabinet in her study, I found a folder labeled Personal Reflections. Inside were pages written in her familiar, measured script. They weren't emotional in the way people expect grief to sound. They were precise. My children believe time entitles them to forgiveness. One entry read, "Time entitles no one to anything. Only responsibility does." Another, written years later, stopped me cold. If they ever challenge this will, it'll not be because they were excluded, it'll be because they were confronted by consequence. Reading her words didn't make me angry. It steadied me. A few days later, Daniel came by again. He spread documents across the dining table, medical evaluations, witness statements, drafts of earlier wills. She revised this will 3 times. He explained, each revision reaffirmed the same intent. Did she ever doubt it? I asked. Never, he said. If anything, she became more certain. The lawsuit arrived 2 days later by certified mail, formally addressed. Impersonal. Notice of probate litigation. Plaintiffs, Eleanor and Richard Holloway. My parents' names looked strange printed that way, stripped of familiarity. They were claiming undue influence, isolation, diminished capacity. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so predictable. Daniel called immediately. They filed in Orange County Superior Court. He said, "They're alleging you manipulated her." I closed my eyes. "She taught me how to document manipulation." I said, "That may be the most useful thing she ever did." Media interest followed quickly. Not aggressively, but persistently. Headlines framed it as a family dispute softened at the edges. People prefer ambiguity when truth feels uncomfortable. At the first preliminary hearing, my parents sat across from me, their expressions carefully neutral. Their attorney, Michael Grant, spoke with practiced confidence. He used phrases like vulnerable elder and emotional dependence. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Daniel responded calmly. Margaret Holloway practiced probate law for 3 decades. She documented every major decision. Medical records confirmed full cognitive capacity. Correspondence demonstrated consistent intent. The judge listened without expression. That night, back at the house, I opened the leather notebook my grandmother had given me years ago. I hadn't written in it for a long time. I turned to a blank page and wrote a single line. Truth doesn't need urgency. It needs record. As the days passed, the familiar tension returned, the kind that forms when people try to rewrite something that was never ambiguous. But this time, it didn't hollow me out. It sharpened me. Margaret hadn't raised me to defend myself loudly. She had raised me to remain precise. The formal hearings began on a Monday morning that felt too ordinary for what it carried. Outside the courthouse, a small cluster of reporters waited, polite but persistent. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, angled slightly toward each other, posture composed. They didn't look at me. Michael Grant stood first. He spoke of vulnerability, of proximity, of a granddaughter who lived with her grandmother and benefited from it. Margaret's name was used carefully, almost gently. I recognized the story instantly. It was the version where responsibility dissolved into circumstance. When Daniel rose, he did so without urgency. He introduced documentation. Exhibits slid across the clerk's desk. The sound of paper felt louder than it should have. The first witness was a former caregiver. She testified that Margaret relied on me for daily matters. Michael stepped forward smoothly, suggesting control, restriction. Daniel objected. Assumes control rather than coordination. Sustained medical evaluations followed. Charts, dates, signatures, advanced age, Michael said. Chronic illness, Daniel responded evenly. Comprehensive cognitive evaluations conducted within 6 months of the will revision. All indicate full capacity. The judge leaned forward, studying the screen. Then, my mother was called. She walked to the stand carefully, her expression already. She spoke of regret, of distance, of wanting to reconnect, before it was too late. "We tried," she said quietly, "but we were pushed away." The room felt very still. Danielle rose slowly. "Mrs. Holloway, do you recall sending this message?" An email appeared on the screen. "Or willing to reconnect, but we need to discuss the estate." The date glowed beneath it. My mother's jaw tightened. "That was misunderstood." Daniel nodded once. Margaret responded the same day, asking you not to contact her again about financial matters. Silence. By the afternoon recess, the courtroom felt different, less charged, more focused. In the hallway, my father passed me. "You didn't have to take everything," he said quietly. "She decided what belonged where," I replied. That night, back at the house, I opened my grandmother's notebook again. One line stood out. "When people speak loudly, listen to what they're trying not to say." Tomorrow, I would take the stand, and for the first time since this began, I felt ready not to defend myself, but to tell the truth exactly as it was, quietly, precisely, without asking for permission. I took the stand the following morning. The courtroom felt smaller than it had the day before, as if the walls had drawn closer overnight. Judge Alan Reeves watched quietly as I was sworn in. His expression was neutral, attentive, the kind that didn't imbibe performance. Dana Brooks began gently. "Please state your name for the record." "My name is Claire Holloway." Michael Grant's head lifted slightly. It was the first time he had looked directly at me. "How long did you live with your grandmother?" Daniel asked. "From the time I was 6 years old until the day she passed." "And during that time did she ever express uncertainty about her estate plans?" "No, she was very clear. repeatedly. Did she discuss those plans with you? Yeah, I said. But not for advice. She informed me after decisions were made. Michael stood smoothly, pacing just enough to suggest control. Miss Holloway, isn't it true you depended on your grandmother financially? I was a minor, I answered evenly. She was my legal guardian. As an adult, I supported myself. Bachu lived in her home, benefited from her resources. I lived where she asked me to live, I said, and I contributed where I could. Isn't it possible your closeness influenced her decisions? Influence requires persuasion, I replied. She didn't ask for mine. A murmur moved through the room. Michael shifted. Did you ever limit your parents' access to her? No, she did. Convenient distinction. Judge Reeves cut in calmly, counseled. Michael nodded and adjusted his tie. Did you ever intercept calls? No. Withhold mail? No. Suggest she revise her will? No. You benefited significantly from her death, didn't you? I met his gaze. I benefited from her life. The room went silent. Daniel stood again. Why do you believe your grandmother left her estate to you? I took a breath. Because she believed responsibility should follow presence. She raised me. She trusted me. Daniel introduced her personal correspondence. I am not confused. I am not pressured. I am precise. Michael objected. Judge Reeves overruled. They speak directly to intent. The final question came quietly. Did your grandmother ever fear this challenge? Yes. What did she say? She said, people who abandon responsibility often return only when consequences arrive. No one spoke. When I stepped down, I felt calm settle over me. Not relief, completion, good closing arguments, came the next day. Michael spoke of proximity and emotional dependence. Daniel responded simply. Proximity can also create responsibility. He read a final letter Margaret had written weeks before her death. This is not exclusion. It is consequence. The judge deliberated. When he returned, his voice was steady. The evidence does not support the plaintiff's claims. The will stands. The estate belongs to Claire Holloway. The gavel struck. Once outside, there were no cameras, no noise, just air that felt lighter than it had in years. Back at the house, the ocean sounded the same as it always had, steady, indifferent. The days that followed did not rush. The silence softened. I sorted papers not to defend anything, but to understand. I walked the shoreline where my grandmother once stood beside me without speaking. My father called once. He said he had read her letters. He apologized without asking for forgiveness. I listed. I didn't rush to fill the quiet dot in her notebook. I found the final note. Quiet is where choice begins. I closed the book and let the quiet stay. The past no longer needed defending. The future no longer waited for permission. And standing there listening to the ocean move in and out, I understood something with calm certainty. The truth had been tested, and it stood.